Good evening, and if I could ask everyone to be ready for us to start the meeting, please, I would appreciate it very much. The Board of Education met in executive session to discuss pending litigation pursuant to KRS 61.8101C of the Open Meetings Act and regarding Eman and versus Capel and others, Jefferson Circuit Court, number 18-C1007405, and two other matters, the identification of which would disclose litigation and settlement strategies and have an adverse effect upon the legal and financial interest of the district. No action was taken while in closed session. I will now entertain a motion to authorize our board counsel to effectuate a settlement in the two matters identified in a closed session and pursuant to the terms discussed in the closed session. Is there a motion, please?
Marshall moves.
Okay, Board Member McIntosh, seconded by Board Member Marshall. All those in favor, would you please raise your hand? The motion passes unanimously. Board Member Craig is not with us this evening, so we will move on with our meeting, starting with our June 22nd meeting. I'd like to call this meeting to order. Welcoming you to the June 22nd meeting of the Jefferson County Board of Education. First of all, is there a recommendation for the approval of the meeting agenda?
Marshall.
Board Member Marshall, seconded by
McIntosh.
Board Member McIntosh. All those in favor of approving the meeting agenda, would you please raise your hand? Thank you. It's unanimous. Next on the agenda is the recommendation for the approval of minutes of the previous meeting. Is there a motion to approve the minutes of the June 8th and the June 15 meetings?
Marshall.
Board Member Marshall, seconded by Board Member
Shaw.
Duncan. Okay, sorry, Dr. Shaw. All those in favor, would you please raise your hand? Motion passes. Thank you. We're going to move on to our work sessions this evening. There are no votes needed at the work sessions. This is for information purposes for the board only. We will monitor our time to make sure that we stay on track for the evening. Thank you, everyone, for being here this evening. Thank you for our staff and others for being here this evening. So at this time, we will move on to our first work session, which is the work session JCPS Strategic Plan Update, the future state of the Jefferson County Public Schools. Dr. Polio.
Thank you, Chair Porter and board members. We will be presenting and giving an update on strategic plan. As you might recall, we started the process prior to COVID and have had to delay continuation of developing the strategic plan because of COVID and not being able to have community-wide sessions and sessions here at the board. We know that you all are going to have some sessions coming up at your work session that will assist in the strategic plan, but we wanted to bring up Dr. Dossett, who is going to talk about the current, where we stand and moving forward, how we will develop the strategic plan. Dr. Dossett.
Thank you, Dr. Polio. Good evening, board members. I want to begin by introducing my co-presenter, Alan Young, who's a resource teacher in our teaching and learning office. He's joining us via Zoom, so he has been an incredible thought partner throughout this process, and so he'll be speaking a little bit later in the presentation. So just as a quick reminder, as Dr. Polio mentioned, the last time we presented to the board on the strategic plan was about a year ago, and boy, lots of things have changed in a year. And so we wanted to give an update tonight of where we are. It's really actually good timing. This was on our agenda, and actually at the last board meeting, I think Dr. Kolb asked for, now how does future state and strategic plan, how do they fit together? And as you all begin work with the Council of Great City Schools consultant, we thought it was a good time to kind of share where we are right now with our framework. And so the slide up above shows where our journey, where we've been, where we're going. And so just as a reminder, this process started in 2015 with our Vision 2020 plan, and then when Dr. Polio became superintendent, we revised and focused in for our Vision 2020 in action, and we're building on that strong foundation for the next strategic plan. And so we've had a core team working on developing a framework. Many of our core team members are both working on the strategic plan and are members of the future state teams, so we can make sure that that work is embedded and aligned across each other, and so we can connect those. So we are working on creating coherence in a framework, building on our strong foundation that we already have in terms of our 3 pillars. We're embedding our future state, and Alan will share how those connect, and then also looking at exemplar plans from other districts. And when we last presented, you all gave us feedback that we really wanted to make sure that we considered the current pandemic and other context to make sure that we're really leveraging the innovative practices that we saw during the last year in place. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alan to talk through our framework.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you tonight, board members, and Dr. Polio, and of course, Dr. Dossett. I just want to say thank you for allowing us to work and present what we've been working on. We've not been just waiting, but this time has allowed us to really focus really deeply on those core kinds of things that we had in our strategic plan, our Vision 2020 and our Vision 2020 in action, and really get it ready for the board and community input that we know that this plan really needs. So this does not pretend at all to be the strategic plan tonight. This is the strategic plan framework that we are putting forth as a a suggestion to you, so that we start with something that has a deep coherence and a shared language that can leverage the future state work that we're working on within one learning ecosystem. So building upon the previous plans, the idea that we had a learner-centered plan before is true, but we had also had things that were very much part of a lot of different compliance features and other things that we still have to take certainly into account. But we wanted to really, through this pandemic and through what we've learned, what's been working well, we really believe that the 3 pillars themselves have been really at the heart of a lot of our change, but we wanted to take them a little bit further to not just have them as pillars, as foundations, but rather as also guiding principles, so that they would be threaded throughout and we could look through them as lenses. And we also continue to have focus areas that we have, but instead of just having them as different areas that you might have like as an outline or something, we're going to be presenting them to you in a more nested kind of way, where the learners really are at the center, and so that their learning, and then the adults, their competencies and how they collaborate in order to create the kinds of learning experiences and environments are very much at the heart of this new strategic plan framework. And then certainly all the structures and support that we need, certainly we learned much about that during our the pandemic and so forth. So Dean, if you could go ahead and switch to that. So let's talk just a little bit about our pillars, but how we tried to talk about how can we not just build upon them, but use them as lenses. And so we'll start first with looking at racial equity, and this, of course, plan certainly has racial equity at the core. This is not any kind of lessening, but rather a leaning into the notion of racial equity. But we wanted to say what is really at the principle of racial equity, and it really is the principle of equity, so that every person must be empowered to thrive, and the whole person. So we use this concept as a lens because it's allowing us to see through that lens, so that we look at our policies, our outcomes, our relationships, and so forth, what it is actually that we will be focusing on throughout. So we don't want to just state this. We want to make sure that throughout that we have a racial equity and equity focus. And the same is true in our area for climate and culture. When we looked at climate and culture, we certainly are noticing how much the climate, the culture, and the community are part of it. But we said, what is the core principle that really is throughout climate, culture, and community? And that is the notion of relationships. So how can we look through our strategic plan through the lens of relationships is another thing that we're putting forward as well. And then certainly our backpack of success skills, which was built upon our deeper learning. And that deeper learning really was more about this notion of engagement. We hear Dr. Polio talking all the time about the critical importance of engaging our learners. And if we can't have our learners engaged, we're not going to be able to get the kinds of outcomes and so forth. So these three principles that we think we're putting forward as the notion of how our strategic plan should be looked through those lenses in order to help keep us focused and coherent. And so as we look forward to this with the learners at the center, you can see that we keep those lenses right there, but really instead of just thinking about a solution-oriented or what is the problem we're trying to fix kind of focus that we had a little bit before, we've switched a little bit to putting for something that is not so static, but rather with the future states, this notion of the future that we desire. So with learners at the center as themselves with agency to be partners in their own learning, we are really trying to turn these particular things into questions. So who are the learners and who do we want them to become? What kind of learning experiences and learning environments do they need in order to thrive? And then what kind of competencies, professional competencies, and what kind of ways do professionals have to work together, their experiences and their environments for them to develop into the kind of professionals that we need to create those kinds of learning experiences and learning environments to develop our learners. And finally, both the learners and the professional adults that are our teachers, our administrators, our educators, all rely on structures and supports. And these structures, you might think of them as a physical thing, but it's really not. This is really the human infrastructure of our district. And so instead of just having these as three different separate categories, we wanted to show them in a way that they are related to each other, that these are not just category A, learners, category B, adult, professionals, and so forth, but rather to show it in this more nested way so that we can show how that they are connected within each of their spheres as well as connected between the areas. The future states themselves, actually, the work is kind of like building the plane while we're flying it. So in some respects, the notion of the future states, what are the future that we desire regarding learning or how we're extending learning or in the areas of facilities and so forth, actually are going through processes themselves that allow them to be embedded within our strategic plan framework. And so you can see that we've tried to show these as ovals so that the notion is that learner-centered is something that we have to think about through all of these particular future states areas as well. In other words, we can't think of facilities, for example, which you might just say would be, under structures, as simply structures that are not related to what the learners need and what for the experiences and environments that they need, or what the adults, educators need in order to make sure that they can create the kind of learning experiences that are needed for our students. And so we've tried to show that these future states will not be all of what our strategic plan is, but they will absolutely form major planks within our strategic plan. And as we work in a stakeholder way in each of these areas, we believe that the learner-centered construct is what can allow them to not just exist separately from each other, but rather in a much more coherent form, as well as to be already fleshing out some of the details of what we'll be looking at within our strategic plan. Now, we've called this a JCPS, community-based, learner-centered ecosystem, because we're really trying to sort of do a 2.0 or something, I guess, with our previous work that we've done to say, how do we build upon it, but make sure it's much more connected, coherent, and relating to each other. But we can't do that without, of course, the board and our community partners, our parents, and so forth. And so now we're just trying to get this kind of in shape for us to be able to move forward to engage our community and stakeholders so that we can start to flesh out what the strategic plan can be.
Thank you, Alan. And so I just want to build upon what Alan discussed and talk a little bit more about our future state work. So we have 7 of those future state teams working, and it's a cross group of teachers, of principals, of central office staff. They've been working for the past 6 months on these steps that are outlined above. And so it really began with identifying the need. What is the need? And what is the issue that we're trying to solve right now? And then looking at the research around what does the research tell us from best practices from other districts around how to tackle that issue. And then the last couple steps that we've been working on recently is what do we envision for our future state and where are we currently and how do we get from where we currently are to where we want to go. And so all of our future state teams have gone through steps 1 through 4, and they were beginning their work on the action steps and identifying what resources are needed to get to those action steps and how will we define whether we're successful or not at reaching that future state. And so we thought this was a good time to come back to the board and present where we are currently and how these two pieces fit together. And in terms of our planning process, this is also a chart that we shared with you early on. We've adapted it to take into account our future state teamwork. And so really what this represents is a lot of feedback loops, a lot of systems by which we're going to be engaging in two-way communication. So our strategic plan team is listening and working with our future state teams and our advisory groups, and we're really trying to turn those big ideas that are coming from the future states into an action plan. And then we will be working also with advisory groups, different constituency groups to get feedback as well as the larger community. So now that we have drafted out a framework, we're going to be engaging with the community to get feedback in terms of what are we missing, what looks good, what do we need to make clear. And then also obviously engaging with the board through this work process as well. So our proposed timeline is to, again, we're sharing the framework and developing that framework and sharing that out this evening, finalizing that, and then working with those advisory groups and the community this fall with the intent to have a plan in place by 2022. So with that, I'm going to open it up to any questions that you might have about our process.
Thank you, Dr. Dossett. I'm going to call us in specific order or just make sure everybody has something to say. We will start the timer with 10 minutes. You don't have to use 10 minutes. You don't have to use any minutes if you don't have any questions or comments. So if you don't mind, I'd like to start with Dr. Schul this evening, and then the next speaker will be Board Member McIntosh. Dr. Schul.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Dr. Dossett, for such incredible work. And Alan, good to see you. Thank you for your presentation and for this inspiring work. I want to further compliment you both on leading the district through the concept of learner agency. I think that is so empowering for our students, because so many times we take the banking concept of education and we see students just as receptacles where we pour certain things down their throats and expect them to regurgitate it through testing. And so I'm really excited about our identifying and respecting every student's agency to learn. And so really excited about that. I just have a few questions. The first is, could you define equity and what we mean by that? I think that would be helpful.
So I'll start, and then Alan, I don't know if you want to join in, but really what we're talking about here when we talk about the strategic plan is our 3 pillars, and one of our pillars is racial equity. So we're
Right.
talking specifically about making sure that we have equity among our student groups, particularly students of color. We're also talking about when we're talking about equity as a lens, we're also talking about other student groups as well, but
Right.
our primary focus is our pillar, which is devoted specifically on racial equity.
And I think that's so critical because we know, per the data in our district, that we are a majority minority district, and many of our students, because of the lack of culturally responsive teaching methods, do not feel a sense of belonging, and that they are not achieving at the rate that they could otherwise. Now, would you help me as it relates to equity, as it pertains to those who are on free and reduced lunch, and how they also are impacted positively by these strategies?
Yes, so when we know that there's a significant overlap between our students of color and students on free and reduced lunch, but we also want to recognize when we're talking about equity and we're talking about our 3 pillars and relationships and engagement, that we're talking about students with disabilities, students on free and reduced lunch, our homeless students, LGBTQ students, that we want to make sure that we have a very inclusive environment for
Right.
all of our students.
Right. So we have been focusing on racial equity and greater inclusion of our student population over the course of the last 3 to 5 years. Have we been able to see an upswing in improvement among those student populations?
So I would say that we still have work to do in that area. So we have seen some shift in terms of a small decrease in disproportionality, not to the degree that we need it to be. We also know that our sense of belonging is lowest among our African American females. So there are some areas that we need to work on, and that's part of what we'll identify in the strategic plan.
And when you say disproportionality, what do you mean by that?
We mean that that we see students of color that are suspended at greater rates than our white students.
Yeah, okay. Well, I just want to applaud you again for this very important work. Of course, racial equity is a pillar of our district, and it is so very necessary because so many students within our district have been historically left behind as a consequence of the incompetence and the outright ignoring of the needs of the variety of minorities in this district. And so we never need to forget that this is a district that is majority minority. And as the representative of the 6th District, I want to be mindful to say that we're not only talking about black children, but we're also talking about our Latinx population. And our schools ought to be places where all students feel a sense of safety, where they feel that their identities are respected, where they're able to learn on their level and feel totally included in the academic environment. So thank you for keeping racial equity as a part of the strategy moving forward in our future state. I stand behind that wholeheartedly.
And if I could just
Exactly
add,
right.
and first of all, I just really appreciate your.
I would ask you to come to order at this time. I would ask you to come to order at this time. I will ask you to come to order at this time. At this time, I will ask you to come to order. I will say for the 4th time, at this time, I will ask you to come to order. This is a work session where we have been presented information and board members have an opportunity to ask questions at this time. At this time, I'm sorry, excuse me. If I need to stop this meeting so that we will have order, we can do that. I do not want to hear your comments. I do not. We will take a 5-minute recess at this point. 5-minute recess at this point. 5 minutes. I would like to call our meeting back to order, please. And we had comments from Dr. Schul, and I think I had called on Board Member McIntosh next. Before you start, I do want to make the statement that the board will start receiving speakers. And when that date is announced, it's a public announcement. It's on the media, it's on our website, it's posted everywhere. So this is the first night that we have increased the number of seats in this auditorium. We will resume speakers at the meeting. It will be publicly announced prior to the meeting. So we will now move on with Board Member McIntosh. Ms. McIntosh.
Thank you guys for your presentation. I know that digging through that data on a regular basis is no small task, especially in a district this size. And using the data to inform our decisions and the information that you guys are able to provide us to help guide our decision making is incredibly valuable. So I thank you for your work tonight, but also your ongoing efforts around that. Just a couple things that I guess maybe I would call more feedback than a question at this point is just as we move forward and I look at the plan over the course of the next year, a couple things that I think I would like to not necessarily see in the documents, because I know these are very broad and a lot more thematic, but a couple things around intentional plans of how these things are going to reach our students in the classroom. So whether that's PD modeling, training for both our classified, or to include our classified staff as well, just so that we kind of have an idea of what the ongoing training is for our staff members around this, I think would be helpful. And then also, when we talk about collaboration, ways that we, in our decision-making as a board or allocation of resources or whatever it happens to be, ways that we can support administrators' work at the school level in being intentional around that collaboration. I know that we, of course, do have our PLCs, but outside of PLCs, building to building, grade level, vertical as well as horizontal, collaboration, I think, are so important that I want to make sure that we're addressing that as far as, I guess, a systems process that we are providing time in the school day or within that training model. You talked about the stakeholders. Can you tell me a little bit about how you all plan, or you may not have it completely fleshed out yet, but how do you plan to elevate student voice within the strategic plan?
Right. Thank you for your feedback. I think the points that you made fit really well with the framework that we're thinking about in terms of the learner being at the center and making sure that we've got staff and systems to support that work. In terms of student voice, I think one of the areas that we're exploring in terms of feedback is to model off of what we were able to accomplish with the handbook, the intervention handbook, and how we were able to bring students to the table for that process. So we're exploring following a similar model to get feedback from students for the strategic plan.
Okay, wonderful. And then just kind of my my follow-up as well. I know that we just recently approved some changes to our, I'm so sorry, I'm drawing a blank.
SPP&G.
Thank you, because it's not the code of conduct anymore, and that's the term
Or
that's
the
stuck in my head. How often are we reviewing that related data with regard to disproportionality, assignments of not necessarily just suspension, but making sure that we're not seclusion, restraints, and assignment to alternative programs and things like that. So how often are we reviewing that data with regard to how it fits into the strategic plan?
Right. That's a great question. And actually, we have what we call vital signs, which are key review of climate and culture data as well as academic data. We do that 3 times a year. At the cabinet level, we have conversations with assistant superintendents around how we can support schools in their efforts, but we show information around disproportionality, suspensions, root causes, and that is something that we also bring to the board on a quarterly basis. Now, we haven't for a little bit of time because of we haven't had significant amount of behavior issues during remote learning, but that's something that we'll, for the 21-22 school year, re-engage in.
Okay. That's all I have. Thank you so much.
And if I could add something to what Dr. Dossett has said, I really appreciate the questions around the data and so forth. I think the notion, just sort of tying back to also Reverend Scholl's question about equity, that our hope is that our look at equity will be that our data will not just be, will become more and more about presence data, what things are in place, not just absence data about what kids don't have, what kids don't show, but rather, you know, trying to gather things about strengths, interests, passions, talents, what competencies are they showing? So that's the presence of things, not just the absence of things. And I think that's an important thing, not just with regard to equity, but this in terms of looking more at a whole child, but also even in terms of our systems and about where we gather data, and also that we look not just at outcomes, but also about processes, supports, and inputs as well. So I just sort of throw that out there to round that answer up a little bit.
No, that's really great. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Okay, thank you very much. Next, Board Member Marshall, and then Board Member Duncan, and then Dr. Chris. Board Member Marshall.
Thank you, Chair Porter, and thank you, Dr. Dossett, for this wonderful work. Thank you, Alan, as well. I think that as we get into this talk about future state strategic plan, I think that the past couple of years have had their share of obstacles to get over. I think coming out of our corrective action was a huge feat, but it put some parameters around some of the work that we wanted to do. I think that the pandemic did that as well. So can we talk a little bit about how, you know, we're looking forward to this year and how that'll allow us to accelerate some work as we get ready to talk about this next strategic plan?
Yeah. I think that's a great point, and really that's part of what is at the heart of what the future state teams are doing. And so the idea, and you heard a little bit about this when Dr. Coleman presented last time around grading practices, but that's what each of the future state teams are doing, are kind of envisioning what we want in order to be the best district in the next 5 years or so. And so it allows us to have that space around being innovative and thinking differently about how students experience learning. And so grading practices is just one example, but we're doing that across all the future states.
Good. And in regards to our future state teams, who compromises those teams? How are they selected to be a part of those teams?
So on the future state teams are central office administrators as well as principals and teachers. And so we worked with our JCTA friends to select the teachers, and then I think the assistant soups were help identify principals that can serve in the roles on each of the future state teams.
Okay.
Also, Mr. Marshall, we will be adding students. Our student superintendent student advisory council will focus on that in the fall, which is to have a collective voice with the superintendent, but also to be a part of these future state teams as well.
Okay. And then you talk about student advisory, and then we also have advisory groups, correct? And who are these advisory groups that are working according to the planning process, work with the strategic plan team.
Right, so those, once we develop the framework, we'll be reaching out to different advisory groups, constituency groups. So our, Crystal Hawkins works with our Title I Parent Advisory Council. We also have lots of community partners and that we'll be working with, as well as Ieq, JCTA, our other union representatives. So we'll be reaching out to various constituency groups to get feedback along the way.
Okay. And do we have a process right now for how often we kind of refresh that list of community partners or advisory groups? Because I think sometimes when we do this work, we know who we know, and sometimes, you know, to push ourselves to reach out. So is there a process where we look at how we can add other advisory groups or different community partners?
Yeah, so I'll work closely with Renee in communications to make sure that we have a broad outreach plan, because you're right, we want to make sure that we hear from as many folks as we can. We want to make a particularly strong effort to those that might not feel quite as listened to or as heard.
Yeah, and I think that's just probably the most important part of the process. I know our first step is identifying needs. And so just making sure that, you know, we continuously look at all community groups, look at all of our advisory groups, to make sure that when we identify these needs, it's not just, you know, some people feel like, well, that's just some people in a room that have no idea what really happens. But to make sure that, you know, we're reaching everyone's needs, but most importantly, our learners and what they need. So I think that, you know, this is going to be one of, if not the most important strategic plan going forward. And I hope that as we continue to look through different lenses, I think we look through the lens of acceleration. I think that it is time for us to do something drastic, something amazing, and I'm looking forward to what comes of it. So thank you for your hard work.
Thank you.
Thank you, Board Member Marshall. Ms. Duncan.
Well, I also want to thank you for keeping the threads going that were established several years ago, and then trying to enhance those. One of the questions I have is about the goal of a future state, which is it's stated to improve outcomes and improve equity in instruction and support. If we improve outcomes, isn't that a measure of the fact that we have improved equity? Can't we, if we see outcomes improving, will that be kind of a measure for that we have, you know, we can affirm that we've improved equitable opportunities for students?
Yes, I think we definitely can look at outcomes and improving outcomes as a way to measure our work around equity. I think what we want to do and still need to do is define what are those outcomes. So both in terms of academic outcomes, but also, as I mentioned before, sense of belonging and experiences. So looking at both learning outcomes, but what types of environments students experience during their time here at JCBE as well.
I know for me, it just felt like it should be stated, improve outcomes through equitable instruction and supports, rather than improve outcomes and improve equity, as if they're two different things, because really, if you don't have equity, then you're not going to get the improved outcomes that we're aiming for. So I don't know, it just, the way it was stated, I just felt like it was two different things rather than, you know, how they relate to each other.
And we want this board to have a big part of the strategic plan will be the goals that you set for us. And so we have some goals, obviously, that we've been shooting for, and we've talked about those many times, but that will be a part of the accountability side of it, are the outcomes that you expect from us.
Right. Another question I had, one of the things that I think needs to be included in our future state is the role of technology in helping students own their learning. You're talking about being student-centered, and which we do mean student-centered, but we also mean student owning or student ownership of their learning. And I think our technology showed us so much this year of the difference that made in students when it fell back on them to do their work through the technology. I think we learned tremendous lessons about how important it was for them to take that ownership. So for me, when we're talking about student owner or student learning, our student-centered learning, we're really wanting student ownership of learning. And I hope that some way or other we can build that into future state, because I do think the role of technology is just going to be huge in helping us improve our outcomes. And I know it's probably woven in here. I know I saw technology is one of the areas in competencies, I believe, but I do think it really needs to be a kind of a front and center support for improving student learning.
Yes.
So
It is one
Yes.
of the teams. So we have a team working on technology, and we have clear goals as to how we want to bridge that digital divide that occurs so often in our community.
yeah, I just hope that it's, it's right along with our other pillars that we have, or it's a subpart, a significant subpart of one of the pillars. So that it's just such a tremendous tool for engagement for our students, and I just think that is future state right there. But thank you all so much for all this work and the more work that is ahead of us in trying to define this new strategic plan, this new strategic vision. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Duncan. Dr. Chris?
Thank you, Chair Porter. Regarding the learners at the center model, which I emphatically agree with, is that an established kind of body of research within education that we're drawing on to figure out what that really means in practice, or is it something we're inventing or some combination?
I'll let Alan speak to that, but no, it is part of a research-based approach, and while we may be adapting it, there is a strong evidence base to Learner Center. So Alan, I don't know if you want to speak to the work that that came about with the learner-centric approach.
Sure. So part of the movement towards deeper,
Quickly.
more personalized learning really was about the including of the learner as a participant in their own learning. And there's really a lot of this, I think it was, someone said this notion, maybe it was, Dr. Schultz said something about this notion of kids as receptacles. That is a banking model of learning that we have not found good research for, but rather when kids themselves are part of the agents by which they grow certain competencies and capacities by which they thrive, they are also not just getting like factoid knowledge or things like that, but the actual kinds of skills, dispositions, and other kinds of competencies that they are able to actually grow the kinds of things they'll need for life as citizens, life in communities, life in the work world, and life in families. And so the research is long in that it goes back at least to John Dewey in the American scene, but also you can see the notion of learner agency and them participating in their own learning certainly as something that's critical throughout. The one thing I would say that's different than when some people have put like students at the center, it's one thing to say that you're doing things to students or doing them for students, but it's another thing to talk about doing them with students or have them come from students. So the research that we are really looking at is what a difference it makes in terms of their engagement when they are the ones that are part of the construction of the experiences and the environments that they participate in. And that engagement itself leads not only to multifold academic growth, but also the notion of sense of belonging, sense of becoming, the sense of being in terms of their own self-efficacy, in terms of how they function and see themselves as learners in their communities. So it's a pretty strong body of research, and it's an international movement. It's kind of been pushed back against the standardizing of movement. It's part of the personalizing of education, and it's everywhere right now.
Great. Is it fair to say, I mean, maybe putting it a little too strongly, but to the extent that there is some kind of central principle or bedrock, cornerstone, whatever visual metaphor you want to use, that what you just described is it basically? Because I mean, if we just look at the relationships, engagement, equity, I mean, if we succeed in doing what you're describing, Alan, it seems like, relationships, engagement, and equity are going to kind of take care of themselves or flow from that. So is it fair to say that student-centered or whatever, we're partners and agency is really the foundational principle that we're looking at?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we're seeing that those, did you say Alan? I thought you said.
Whomever, yeah.
Okay.
I would agree,
So,
Alan. I think, yes, learner is at the center. I would say that it's still important to look at it through those lenses, to think about systems and making sure that if you're
Sure.
how that learner interacts with the system.
Yeah, no, I agree. It just, I guess I'd really like to see a summary of, I guess, that extensive body of research at some point.
Yeah, Education Reimagined think tank is part of where we draw that information from, but we can pull together some resources.
Yeah, that'd be great. I'd love to get a Cliff Notes version of it for now, anyway. Let's see, sorry, figure out my notes here. Well, this may be kind of down the line, but are we, as we think about this model that you're describing, are we devising or adapting from the research indicators that will tell us if we're succeeding or not? Or is that something kind of coming in the future?
That's coming in the future, but yes, we will want to do that. We really wanted to make sure that we were strong on our framework, but absolutely, we'd want to make sure that we've got ways in which we can tell whether we're on the right path and indicators that we're looking at along the way.
Okay. When you say, so the advisory groups, if you don't have to go back to it, but that slide with the 4 different colored rectangles with different pieces in it, advisory groups is one and then community is one. Is there a difference there between those, or?
So I'm using advisory groups as more of our constituency groups, and then the community is the broader community.
Just kind of general, come one, come all. Okay. So one of the things that the main set of comments I have is about, like, I love everything I've heard, and I assume many of my colleagues do as well, but like, I don't recall anybody ever asking the board, if we wanted this learner-centered thing. I do, of course, but, how do we know that what we're talking about are things the board, really wants? And if we've got a timeline where we're set to approve it in, December 2021, I mean, that's a tight timeline, and I mean, I'll let my other colleagues speak for themselves, but I don't feel like, I as a board member have been very involved in this. Really, honestly, I don't feel like I've been involved at all. So, I'm a little concerned that this has been happening, for 6 months with minimal to no board involvement. I mean, questions like, where do we want to go? How will we judge if we're successful? I mean, those are questions that really the board, needs to have foundational input on. I mean, that's our role, in terms of community. I mean, you're looking at 6 tonight, but, we're the 7 people who the community's elected to be their voice, which isn't to say that that's where it should stop. The community's voice should stop. But but if my kind of input into this, main input into this, is that the board needs to be much more involved in the process. And because, unless I'm mistaken, this is the first time I think that we've heard any real kind of substance about it. And I don't, as a board member, I would prefer not to have it reported to me what, only reported to me what the strategic plan is going to be. I would prefer to, to craft it. I think that's one of the board's central responsibilities. So however we want to figure out how to do that going forward, my primary feedback is that the board needs to be involved at a much more granular level, not in terms of educational expertise, but in terms of, not in terms of saying how we accomplish A, B, C, or D, but what A, B, and C, and D are that we do want to accomplish. And I like what I've heard, so that's great, but there was no guarantee that that was going to be the case based on the input that we haven't had up to this point. So that concludes my comments.
Yeah, thank you. We'll take that and I believe a good portion of our work session, or not the work session, the board retreat will be, and we will take our guidance from you at that, after that, if you would like major change.
I would like to thank everyone for the work that you've done thus far. This is the beginning. This is not the end. A couple of things I would like to say is, as we move forward with our strategic plan, one of the goals of our work as a board with the Council of Great City Schools is to in fact work with Dr. Dossett and Dr. Polio as we move forward collectively. It's the first time that we've had the guidance of the Council of Great City Schools to work with us. So we will have a voice and we will use our voice. So I don't want our board to think that this is it. This is not it. This is the beginning. And we are, as board members, beginning our work with the Council of Great City Schools. So there will be an opportunity for us to speak more. I thank you for the work that you've done. One of the things that I am extremely concerned or looking for is accountability as we build a plan. And we, excuse me, we know that there are things that we need to work on. The other thing, I think that we are not doing our best to let the community understand the population that we serve. We talk about it, and we talk about the diversity of our district, but I think that we need to make the community truly understand who our population is and who we are and where we came from. And why I am honored to be here is I do represent the community of children that are needing more supports in learning, and I will be speaking to that very strongly. But we all are representing different parts of this county, and yes, if you go to the website, you'll see the map. But what we are not clear about, I think, from hearing some people speak, is the numbers. And we are who we are, and we're proud of who we are. So as we move forward with this plan, I would like for us to identify what our student population is, and the fact that we do represent Jefferson County, different parts of Jefferson County. So I think that's extremely important. And as we talk about needs of our students, there has to be some strategic opportunities for us to look, evaluate, and discuss. I am looking forward to your work always, and I'm looking forward to the board's work. This is the first time that we will be working under the direction of the Council of Great City Schools. And we've done this different ways, different years. So this is this year, and what we're hoping to move forward collectively to do our best work on this. I'm not going to point out a lot of little bitty items right now, but I want to thank you. We do understand that this is not the end. This is the beginning. I want to thank the board for your comments tonight, and know that your comments will continue to be welcomed as we move forward, and questions will be answered as we move forward. That's all I have. Thank you. And Dr. Polio, I'll call on you to bring closure before we move on.
Thank you for your feedback. We'll move forward with this. Like I said, we'll be doing sessions with the Council of Great City Schools, most likely at our board retreat at the next meeting, but we will continue this and obviously follow your direction on both strategy, vision, and accountability when it comes to the strategic plan. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Enjoyed your presentation.
Thanks, Dina.
Thank you, Alan, also. Thank you from a distance, but thank you. The next item in our work session, it has to do with our legislative update. So Dr. Polio, if you would like to introduce that, please.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Porter. What better way to continue the night than to talk about the General Assembly? We did want to do this earlier as we finished the General Assembly in April, I believe, is when it closed. But obviously, because of the things we've had on the calendar, we've had to bump this back. But we did want to bring you changes in statute looking back and looking forward as we look towards the General Assembly for 22. So I'll turn it over to Abby Piper, and I would like to thank her for her great work for advocating for JCPS through a very difficult session, because much of it was she's very good at storming the halls of the Capitol and talking to legislators, and was not able to do that this year. So most of it was from her living room or household office, I believe. So Ms. Piper, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. Can you all hear me okay? I'm a little soft-spoken. All right, so I'm actually very excited to be here and talk about this work tonight. We have been hard at work the last year building advocacy systems, streamlining our systems, and making sure they're more efficient, making sure they're more equitable, and bringing more voices to the table. I'm really, really proud of this work, and I hope that that shows. I'm going to briefly go through kind of what we have put together in the last year, some outcomes of the legislative session, although, you know, we have covered a lot of that already, but just sort of a brief recap, and then very quickly, what happens next, what happens during the interim, and what happens between now and the 2022 General Assembly. So with no further ado, that is not the right button. Keep going. Oh, there's some artwork. I'm so glad you came out today. All right. So this is starting my fourth year here with JCPS doing this work, and over the time we have continued to build those systems and really model the advocacy work after the priorities set by the board and set by Dr. Polio and his leadership. So this year we really ramped up our capacity because we know that these are such important issues, and we know that whatever we do, it matters for kids. And so we want to be able to spread our wings as widely as we can. So this year, for the first time, we had our very first advocacy blog, the JCPS Policy Watch, and we used that primarily to help our staff and our families and our students understand what happens in Frankfort, where are the education bills, and what's of impact, and you know, how do they advocate? How do they find the resources, make their own decisions, and call their legislators and ask for what they want? And so that was a big part of sort of community outreach and community education this year. I think you'll see that continue to grow in the coming months, but that's an exciting part of our outreach. I had an intern from the University of Louisville this year. I was very grateful to have her. Her name was Maddie Daly. Maddie was 10 hours a week, all hands on deck, unpaid, and she came and she worked her tail off. So she was great and really helped me navigate this very tough session where obviously we had to learn to advocate in a totally different manner. So very, very grateful for that. You'll see more of that in the coming session as well. And these last three really go together. So we had kind of informally looked at an advocacy team in the prior year, but this last session we really formalized that and galvanized that. And so that process is where instead of me saying, all right, here's the bill, and we try to figure out where do we go as a shop of one and with some guidance from Dr. Polio, we bring in as many voices as we can. And so that advocacy team is comprised of folks from our DEP department, from general counsel, from chief of staff, and others as we need to bring them in based on their level of expertise in a particular area or particular bill. And so we would go through that, and we'd run that through a policy analysis and through a racial equity analysis. And so that we can identify really well, to deepen our understanding, essentially, of the implications of a policy were it to pass. And so that's the kind of streamlining system where we gain more feedback and better systems and stronger systems to better advocate for our kiddos and our families. All right, finally got the hang of this. So we're going to just briefly, I'm not going to belabor this. We've obviously talked about this quite a lot, but kind of ground ourselves in where we were from the legislative agenda last year, some overarching outcomes, and then we'll talk about what's next. And I want to leave more time for questions than not, so I won't belabor this. We've talked about funding for years in public education. That's no secret to you. What you will hear primarily throughout this presentation is that the budget that we had this year is largely the budget that we had last year. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but essentially, drafting a budget, as you all know, during a pandemic is difficult. It's no less difficult for the legislature, and so they chose to break that up into one-year budgets in 2 different years, which I have never seen in my lifetime in Kentucky. So hopefully we'll be back to the 2022 biennial budget in the spring, but you'll largely see the same items throughout. We did oppose private school scholarship tax credits, but that bill obviously did pass. It was House Bill 563. You all know that that had 2 components to it, the open enrollment and the education opportunity accounts. That bill is in court now, so there's nothing else to say about that until we see what happens in the courtroom for that. When we see, and I should have written this out, I suppose, the ARC funding, what we talk about in ARC funding and policy spheres is the actuarially required contribution. So that's the number that economists say you should put this amount of money into the pension system in order to keep it whole. And so the legislature for the last several years and this year has continued to fully fund that actuarially required contribution, which is great, keeps our pension systems as healthy as they can be. So we're grateful for that. They also fully funded health insurance for our folks, with the exception that they did not fund health insurance for our pre-65 retirees, so folks who have retired but have not hit the age of 65 yet. I want to be clear, those people will not have to pay out of pocket for their health insurance. It will likely come out of the TRS trust fund, but in future budgets, we obviously would like that to be fully funded in the state budget. We had actually a great year in equity. We really did, and I'm proud of that work and of the team that really rolled their sleeves up to help us border to border in Kentucky. And so the legislation on minority representation that we have championed for the last 3 years had never seen the light of day in a committee until this year. And this year, with the help of Senator Julie Rocky Adams, we were able to get that, and she really did carry it well for us all the way through the Senate, passed unanimously out of a House Committee of Education, and had 2 hearings on the floor, 2 readings. We simply did not get it to that 3rd and final reading with a final vote. So one small step away from achieving passage on that. We're going to take another crack at that as soon as we can. But really, that's a mile marker. The other 3 items in equity here, those things were not really addressed in bills that were moving. But again, it's a short session, have to do a budget. That's a tough thing to do. Right, we'll carry on. All right, accountability. This is something we also had success in, and we were fortunate that we did not have to do it statutorily. So we were able to do this through executive branch lobbying, and that's really where we talk through the cabinets and get those done through administrative regulation. The statewide accountability testing that we discussed and that was on your legislative agenda that this body passed asked that if we are required to take state accountability testing right after a pandemic, that the data not be used for high-stakes decision-making in schools. So all that data will be out there, and it will be public for the public to look at and for our schools to look at to inform the work, but will not be the cause of putting some school in or out of priority status. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but some of it has to do with reliability of data and just the problems of trying to get all the kiddos back in the building at the right time. And so we want to make sure that if we're going to make those decisions, that the data is reliable. The second part of that has to do with a statistical sample size, and that's a little bit technical and in the weeds, but it was also on your legislative agenda. That has to do with, again, how you make decisions on accountability, high-stakes decisions for schools. So if you're going to be a school that goes into CSI or TSI status or exit CSI or TSI status, the premise of increasing that value of N from 10 to 30 is simply increasing the sample size by which those high-stakes decisions are made. No transparency is lost. All the data is still publicly available. And that has just been amended and changed through the administrative regulation process and approved last week. So 2 big wins there. We were not able to tackle any of the board member burden items. Again, very loaded session, but we have time during the interim to take a crack at those as well. And again, 2 wins in health, so a good session here. We were able to help with legislation that helped close a loophole in taxation of vaping systems, which, as we know, is a great deterrent for populations, especially our young populations, that we know that this product has deleterious effects on their health and their brain development. Finally, and again with the help of Senator Julie Rocky Adams, last year in the budget we were able to work with her to make the language available for $7 million of mental health service practitioners in schools. That is across the state, but it is important and a nice note from the legislature that they do want us to invest in mental health in schools. It's a great nod, and so that was again included this year. So all in all, a pretty productive session during a very challenging time. I credit that to the fact that you have a team here that works tirelessly, and every time I call someone and I say I need help, they answer the phone. So really excited about where we are in this advocacy sphere and excited about what comes next. All right, so what comes next has to do with the bottom line, which is we want to be student-centered in everything. We want to find common ground, and we want to have positive outcomes for kids and for families. And so part of that is redefining those systems and making sure they're as sophisticated as they can possibly be, that our outreach is full and complete, and that we are really at the heart of what kids need. So the next 3 slides are basically, this is what happens during the interim. It's sort of a ready, set, go, right? So the first thing we do is we pull together our research, and that is research can include anything, just like we would ask our students to do before they form arguments and perspectives. So we're going to talk to our cabinet members and the teachers, folks on the ground, and make sure that if there are statutory barriers to their success, that we are aware of those and that we can be part of advocating for better systems and better policies. We want to make sure we have a bank of research to draw upon from things like per pupil, increases in per pupil spending on student outcomes, mental health needs for American students, all of those things, so that that peer-reviewed research can really inform the work alongside of our legislators who we are working with every day. And then, of course, we have our own data, and our own data is always changing, so it's always a good time during this interim to get a pulse check now that we've finished out the year on where our student data is and where our highest needs are and what that advocacy looks like. So once we've got that ready to rock and roll, we are ready to strategize. And right now, we are kind of bleeding in between these 2 areas. We are doing research and pulling all of that together, but we are also starting to look at our strategy development. And so, obviously, I won't belabor this, but we want to develop a strategy that is student-centered at all times. We want to build upon those racial equity efforts to make sure all kids have a fair chance at getting a quality education. We want to target those misperceptions that are out there about the district and do that by bringing folks in and showing them the work. And we want to empower our stakeholders. We have allies and people out there that really champion public schools. We need to make sure we keep them informed and part of this work. So when we build those strategies out, you'll see that this is not just JCPS advocacy. This is statewide public education policy advocacy, and we have many partners in that work. And the last thing is, we're ready to go. So now, once you get past that part, we will be in the initiation stage. That's really at the heart of the interim, when interim committees are going and we're having conversations with lawmakers. And that is the time where we take those issue briefs where we've pulled the research together and we say, we're passionate about this. Can you find some common ground with us? Strengthening those relationships on both sides of the aisle, making sure that we are thorough and comprehensive, and that folks know we're here and we're ready to work and ready to do the work with them. So the final thing is that we want to make sure we bring all the appropriate partners to the table. We have great business partners. We have great nonprofit partners and agency partners and association partners across this state. We want to make sure they are engaged in that work and a part of those conversations. So the last thing I will leave you with is something that I keep. This is my favorite quote of Dr. Polio's. I keep this on a note card in my bag at all times when I'm on Capitol Hill, and I keep it in mind because it is such a good reminder that it doesn't matter, all the noise doesn't matter. We're here to do work for kids, and every time we have a success for a kid today, it will impact kids tomorrow. And so I want to leave you with that, and I'll hand it back over to Dr. Polio or take any questions, but truly want to make sure that you all know that this is work we're passionate about, we are energized about, and we are not backing down.
Thank you, Abby. I appreciate that. And the recap, so good job. I wanted to wrap up a little bit by just saying where I think we are going. I was at the KASS, Kentucky Association of School Superintendents, last week. There were about 150 of us there, and we talked significantly about school funding and the concern around school funding, specifically how much we have lost in the past decade to 15 years, with the SEEK being flat and losing other pools of money like professional development and transportation, and mix in with that inflation and how much our students have lost money when it comes to the SEEK funding, to the point where there is discussion about a potential second Rose type case, a Rose decision from Kira in the 80s. Because right now we are not funding our schools the way we should be funding, and I know we've talked about that many times here in multiple sessions that we have had. But I can tell you this, I'm going to be a strong advocate in the year to come about increasing school funding, because what we have, and people will say that $25 million to scholarship tax credits is not impacting our funding, but it is taking away dollars that could be invested in our public school students. And we have to be champions for that, and I will be a champion for that. Secondly, there is some discussion about SEEK funding and looking at the formula. It does concern me about the SEEK funding, because I do believe there's potential for Jefferson County to be losers in this situation, meaning we lose more money and give money that our taxpayers are putting to the students of Jefferson County and give them to other counties. And that should be what our citizens in this county should be up in arms about, that we're taking money from our own students and giving them to counties with less funding. There's a lot of irony in that right there, that what we just said. But I can tell you I'm going to be a champion for this. We are going to stand up and we are going to fight for the funding. We are being asked by legislators to please give us the dollar amount as what it means to full funding. But I'm not sure they want to hear what that answer is. So we are rallying up the superintendents. We are going to be strong. If people don't want local taxes to increase, then the state budget and the state legislators must fund our schools fully, and we won't have to do that. I stood up in front of the superintendents and said that, and I believe we're going to have a unified front come 2022. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Polio, and thank you, Ms. Abby. I will call on the board members like I did last time. You may have comments, you may have questions, and you may just say thank you. So I just want to give everybody an opportunity to use their voice, starting with Dr. Schul.
Thank you, Chair Porter. Thank you, Ms. Piper, for such a wonderful, energetic report. And thank you, Dr. Polio, for standing up about funding. That is something that the citizens of Louisville ought to be up in arms about. I have a few questions for you. As you speak about funding and the enthusiasm in the legislature about our mental health efforts, is there any potential for the legislature to begin funding for mental health supports?
Sure, and they already have. So that part of that budget line item that we've discussed what was funding for that. I think everyone recognizes that there are limited general fund dollars. There's an increasing mental health need, not just for students, but the legislature certainly understands there's a growing mental health need for adults as well. So I can very much see that on their radar.
Very good. Thank you. Also, as it relates to our legislative agenda, are there any efforts toward legislative partnerships with other districts? So, we know there are a lot of very idiotic bills. I was trying to find a better word, and that was the only word that would come. that are coming through the legislature. And my concern is that Louisville seems to be fighting some of these fights alone. I'm wondering what are the possibilities surrounding partnering with other districts that might have similar concerns and have similar student populations, if we in some way develop some partnerships with them to fight some of this legislation that could have disastrous effects on our districts and the students that we serve.
So I'll answer that, Dr. Schull. First of all, I have a real interest in starting discussions about having a caucus, so to speak, or a collection of the top 10 districts in the state by enrollment, and bringing together, because we represent the majority of the students in this state, and obviously the majority of the students of color are in our largest districts. So I think we have an opportunity to have a strong block and speak collectively. I have challenged KASS and our superintendent group that we are not aligned enough together in our work and begin it early enough. We often are busy in the work of school and not making sure we keep our eye on those things that could impact us down the road. So we are going to do that, and we are going to have a strong group. Also already had connections with the superintendent in Fayette County, the new superintendent, Dr. Liggins, and excited to partner with him. I've always felt that JCPS and Fayette County Public Schools need to have a very close partnership because, you know, that encompasses close to 150,000 students in this state and the majority of students of color. And so the other district that seems to be attacked the most outside of JCPS is Fayette County. I will actually be his mentor in the new superintendent process. Poor guy. I don't know how much I can help him. I'll try my best. But we will have a close alignment. So I think that's going to be really important moving forward.
Do those 10 districts that you have on your list, do they have an Abby Piper in each of those districts?
No, they don't.
Okay.
No, they don't. We're fortunate. I think does Fayette have a representative contractor? So there are some that contract with lobbyists, but I don't think they do.
Okay, thank you. And my final question, as we strengthen relationships with legislators, is there any possibility of inviting some of those individuals into our schools to actually see what is happening in our buildings? I feel that there is so much misunderstanding about what happens in our buildings because so many people haven't been. So are there any efforts to invite, and not just Louisville legislators, but people all across the state? Can we put them on a bus and get them here so that they will understand the people who are really impacted by their decisions?
Yes, absolutely, and that is part of what we are looking at in strategy development now is getting folks in the buildings and really engaging in the work. We are fortunate that the School Administrators Association is sponsoring a Principal for a Day program that goes the third week of September, and that's really for local lawmakers to come and shadow a principal for a day. We're obviously going to be engaged in that, but more so getting folks from outside of Jefferson County to come see the work of the academies, which I think is so important, and some of our really nice magnet schools and things like that. Absolutely, they have to come and see the work if they want to, want to be part of our success.
Right. Are we targeting people on the education committee?
So yes, but also, it's important for this board to know that while the majority of legislation that concerns our district goes through the Education Committee, there are significant pieces that also go through healthcare and justice and judiciary and some of those other committees. So really what we need to do is to look at it on an issue basis and make sure that we're bringing folks to the table for the right issues that they are already passionate about and help them understand the work.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Schull. Board Member McIntosh.
Thank you so much for all of your work. I know that this was a very difficult session to get through. It was very emotional, I think, on the part of those of us who were watching, as well as some of the legislators that were participating. And I'm very pleased because when I see under strategize and initiate targeting those misperceptions, I would probably even go so far as using stronger language there, whether it's fallacy, intentional miscommunication sometimes. I'll just call it out so that you don't have to and no one else does. I know that, for example, the public understanding as well around how Ieq works. I can't tell you the number of people that I have argued with over the years, well before I was in this seat, that no, Jefferson County doesn't get $4,000 per pupil, and we have not for years. And that rather than 100% of transportation funds, the Ieq formula has been amended to, what is it, 56, 58% of the transportation costs. We haven't received textbook funding in over a decade from the state, yet they still require textbooks or a curricular substitute in terms of materials. And so I think after some of Dr. Polio's comments a few moments ago, I was ready to hop in the car and ride to Frankfurt right now and start knocking on doors. So my only question, and I'm just going to kind of piggyback off of Pastor Scholl, is I don't know what it would look like, but I would love to invite our, especially Jefferson County legislators who continue to post on social media, comment to the Courier-Journal and other local media stations, outright mistruths about whether it's the funding, whether it's student assignment, whether it's how the budget works. And I don't know if they are just uninformed in their position, which they should not be. So I would advocate or welcome any kind of conversation around, I don't know what we would call it, legislator boot camp, or provide them with some sort of summer program where we could sit down and talk with them across the table, because that certainly is not all of them. And I don't want to characterize all of our Jefferson County representatives in a negative light, but I do think that we have to address that a lot of our constituents look to them as leaders, as they should. And unfortunately, the information that's being communicated to our shared constituents is not always accurate. And so I applaud the efforts to correct some of that. I am happy to jump in any way I can in my capacity as a board member. But I think that the social studies teacher in me is coming out, and I think that we need to do I think we need to be very intentional about educating our legislators and our public. So I thank you for that.
So thank you very much. You know, and a couple things is, first of all, added to your list of things not funded is K-TIP. So we have a teacher shortage crisis in this state. And so talking to superintendents around the state, they have it much worse than we do. So rural areas across this state right now, they have teacher vacancies all over the place that no one has applied for in the better part of a year, and really don't have a lot of prospects of filling them. And so anytime we lose a teacher, the impact of that is going to be enormous. And so we have been stripped away from that mentoring program that was around for so long to help onboard our teachers and have them, you know, in that internship program. So I think that's a huge part of it. So, and then we have to keep in mind, I mean, that the numbers right now in Frankfurt around the supermajority, you know, impact even our local legislators, and so they will tell us that too, is around that caucus. So it's getting outside of Jefferson County, which is going to be critical for us too.
Thank you. Board Member Marshall, and then Board Member Duncan.
Thank you, Chair Porter. Thank you, Abby, for your awesome work. I don't wish what you have to go through on a lot of people, because I know it is a lot of work. And I don't have a lot to add, but I will ditto the points from other board members and bring up a point that Chair Porter made in previous discussion, particularly around these misperceptions. And I think as big as a gap that we have in our own county about who JCPS really is and what we're really doing, I think the gap is even bigger when it comes to Frankfurt. So when we're talking about strategizing, we're talking about empowering stakeholders, informing leaders with research. Abby, are we wasting our time? Like, where do we find the hope? Dr. Polio talks about supermajorities. You know, we're pushing for a lot of transformative change, yet we're faced with lawmakers who push policy that seems to only harm us. And they push policy that gets them reelected, and we have to go through more and more hoops that prevent us from doing the work we need to. So can you give me some hope, Abby?
Absolutely, I can. I will say this, and it's no different than the service that you all provide. People sacrifice great expense, great time, sometimes time away from work and such to be elected lawmakers. And that goes for everybody on both sides of the aisle, and that's just a fact. I think that having worked with lawmakers for the better part of the last decade, I will say people want to come to the table and they want to work. People don't want to fight. We want to get the best outcome. It's just always that question that hinges upon our democracy, which is how do we get there? And that's part of the exercise. But part of the exercise is also making sure that we do our due diligence to provide them with the information that is out there. And that means peer-reviewed research. That means giving them the data from our district. That means bringing them into the buildings and showing them the work and letting them be part of it. So to some extent, I think that it doesn't matter, actually, to me, who is in power. It's about whoever's there. We want to make sure that we can get to the table with them and we do the best we can to find common ground.
I will be the half-empty guy. You know, and Abby is right. Not all of them, the vast majority of legislators we sit down and talk to are very receptive about the work we're doing in JCPS and supportive. But we also have to know that is a national playbook right now with things like privatization, scholarship tax credits, charter schools. You know, that is a playbook from across the nation right now that is being pushed on Kentucky legislators pretty aggressively. So we just have to be aware that this is not just a local or a state initiative. This is happening all across, or has already happened all across America.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think we've got, you know, a big fight on our hands, but I think that our kids are worth it. So, you know, whatever support you need, I know that this board member supports you 100%. So thank you so much for your hard work.
Ms. Duncan.
Abby, also, I want to thank you publicly for the hours that you spend keeping us informed. I love reading your reports. They're detailed, but they're also, they give us the complete picture of things, as complete a picture as we can get. And I really appreciate the time that you put into that. And no, I mean, I try and thank you every time, but know how much really we all benefit from your knowledge and your sharing of that information. You know, one of the things we're talking about, the funding, when I first got on the board, I remember we were spending $7 million for our ESL population. And 16 years later, that's how much Jefferson County was spending. And now 16 years later, we're spending, I think, up to $30 million to support our ESL population, which has grown over that time period. And the state, I think, we still get the same amount of money from the state, 1-point-something million, maybe a little bit more. It's grown just a little bit more, but it's still under $2 million that we get to help us meet the needs of a growing population. So, yeah, funding is huge for us, and it does. If we get more from the state, then that does take the pressure off locally, at least slows that pressure down to increase our taxes and the things that we need. I just had one question about the proposal on changing the language or I guess requiring that there be minority representation on superintendent selection committee. If that is a law and then that applies to all districts, does that affect our desire for local control, where we're on one end we're arguing for local control, but then on the other hand we're saying we want the state to tell us to be sure that we have minority representation on the selection committee, when sometimes some of these districts may not have large numbers of minority residents in their system. So does that kind of look like one's local, we support local control, but then we don't?
Yeah, it's a great question. The bill text that was filed this year actually would not apply to all districts. So it only would apply to majority minority districts like us, where 50% or higher student population is a population of color. And in that instance, they've already legislated this. So we don't have any local control now. The statute is simply out there for current superintendent selection committees. This would simply clarify and provide a statutory mechanism for us to have that minority inclusion on that committee, because it does not exist in current statute. There are 7 other districts in the Commonwealth of Kentucky who are majority minority districts. Some of them are small, some of them are large, and all 7 of those superintendents signed on with Dr. Polio to support that language and thought it was beneficial.
Very good. Thank you for clarifying that. Thank you so much, Abby. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Chris?
Thank you, Chair Porter. I'm not sure how you keep your positive attitude, but I'm glad you do. I'd accuse you of being naive, but I know you too well. So, how we know, per Dr. Polio's half-empty comment, we know we're likely to see an onslaught of, fair to say, legislation that may be damaging to JCPS. Are we able to anticipate what some of that will be? I'm sure there are always surprises, but to what extent are we able to anticipate and prepare for that sort of thing?
Well, we can't really, we don't really know what's going to happen until it gets filed. But we do keep relationships with folks who, express their concerns with what's happening in the district. But I would say, really, I would be remiss to say that something might or might not happen until it's actually in bill form, and that's just based on close to 15 years now in politics.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want you to speculate on anything specific at this point, but I mean, is it something that you do in your office with other people that you trust? And
well, there are a lot of maps in my office, and there are a lot of books in my office, so a lot of work happens there. But really, I'm focused on the kiddos, and so I'm looking at what our kids need right now, and trying to be proactive about that. Educators, and this is not unique, education professionals across this state and across the country have always been under attack for some reason or other. I think that will probably happen till the end of time, and so I don't spend overly a lot of time fretting about what might happen, but rather on what we need to happen.
And if I could add to that, I think we have to be honest about the strategy that's occurred over the past 3 or 4 sessions, and we can't be surprised, which is the meaningful bills are not discussed hardly at all until the last week of, and they've had an effective strategy of getting them passed into other bills. And so that's where I've challenged the superintendents to say, we can't wait until the last week of session and something is rolled out, and to have us jump up and down at that point and say that we have to be engaged from this point forward with our agenda and what we expect to see, and continue to be engaged constantly throughout this.
yeah, and I think on a fair number of issues, I think it probably is possible to have, reasoned dialogue with people and, change some hearts and minds. I think there are other issues where, as you point out, I don't think you put it this way, but when you're discussing the national forces behind some stuff where, it is a power game and a power balance. And I come from partially, at least, the world of community organizing, where you fight a lot of David versus Goliath battles. And there are some sometimes effective strategies that are employed within that realm to, when you're trying to punch upward, as it were. Something that I would like to see us do, and you can tell me if you're already doing this or not, but is really identify the strengths and the power base that JCPS does have, and use those more effectively. Where we provide quite a lot of stuff to KDE, for instance, and by extension, other districts throughout the state. We have a large number of constituents, obviously, in Louisville, both of our schools and of elected representatives. For the most part, I think at this point in time, we have a decent amount of public support. Certainly not every unanimous, but are there ways that we are exploring, I guess, using the capabilities that we do have and the base that we do have to be more effective outside of the straight, kind of lobbying approach?
I'll start. I think it's important what we said to Dr. Schul, which is a collective approach to it. Mm-hmm. And I try to challenge the superintendents to say anything that attacks public education, even if it doesn't impact your district immediately, is going to have an impact on you. And so therefore, you need to stand up for public education in the state. So I think that's a big thing. I do want to compliment Commissioner Glass. Commissioner Glass has been very courageous and making public statements about what education in Kentucky needs to be, whether that's around racial equity or whether that's around funding for schools. So that is where I hold a lot of hope, is the alignment with Commissioner Glass too. But I think your point is well taken. I just don't think a few of us are going to get this done.
No, and I agree. And I think another piece of that, is the local community, in addition to the statewide community. And, this isn't, something that would be realistic to expect you personally to do, but I wonder, is there a way to coordinate, I guess, the local community more intentionally than we have been to, like we were just talking about with the Ieq and, Louisville tax dollars going all over the state, to better educate about the public about what is happening to their tax dollars that are not going to their kids?
Yeah, that's a great question, and you will see us get more intentional about that. We have, over the last several years, we've always worked with our partners at the Chamber and our partners in the nonprofit sector as well, but I think you will see us be more deliberate about that. And I also want to say that, it doesn't just have to be within the education sphere. We have partners in the urban leagues in Fayette County as well as in Northern Kentucky. We have partners with the Chambers of Commerce and other areas. There are multiple issues that we lobby on all the time that have a lot of different support for them, and I think you might see that we get more intentional about that.
And I do think Yes for JCPS was a roadmap for us.
I'm sorry, say it again.
The Yes for JCPS campaign in the fall was a roadmap for us because we had such a cross-section of supporters that I think that's what we're going to have to do. It's not quite the same where you have election day and there's there's the end of the line, but I think we're going to have to use that as a roadmap.
Yeah, I mean, just so many issues that people care about in the community, from folks like GLI to, a very small community or neighborhood group, that so many issues that folks, specific issues folks care about can be just overwhelmed by state action, I guess. And so to coordinate, activity to the extent that anybody can among community partners, I think it'd be something we should really devote, and I'm telling you something you already know, but for everybody else, I think we should devote time and resources to that, because the balance of power in Frankfort is not going to change anytime soon. So we got to figure out how to be effective in maybe some non-traditional ways. I think that's all I have, but thanks for the presentation, and thanks for the incredible work that you do in Frankfort every year.
Thank you. I'd like to say thank you, Abby, for the work that you do by sending us information to read, by joining us sometimes at meetings to offer support. I thank you for sitting with me at the Metro Council Equity and Inclusion meeting to give the legal side. And I thank you, Ms. Duncan, for bringing up the information about the Superintendent Screening Committee. That is a state law, and it's been a state law. And Senator Gerald Neal is the person that got one minority on that screening committee years ago. This year, thanks to Abby and her team, we were able to get, and Senator Julie Rocky Adams sponsored and Senator Gerald Neal was the co-sponsor, we were able to get everything going in order to make the screening committee for the superintendent more reflective of the student population that the district serves. We made it all the way to the vote, and then for whatever reason, we were not able to, the vote did not happen. But what we must know is we cannot give up on things like that. We have to have our student population represented all the time. As it pertains to people coming to their districts and seeing what's going on, my doors are open in District 1 for anybody that wants to come and to see. And I have had some people come to District 1 schools and walked away amazed. So let's not form impressions from a distance. Let's spend some time and see actually what's going on in our schools. I'm not going to go on and on, Abby. I thank you for the work that you do. It's not easy work, and we are better for you for having you with us, work with us as we move forward. That's all I have to say. Thank you, and thank you again. Dr. Polio, anything else you would like to say?
Thank you, Abby. We appreciate the presentation and all of the input and feedback as we move forward. We will continue to update you, and obviously in the light of what we're saying, we will be working to bring you our priorities at an earlier date this fall, because that's going to be imperative as we face the long session. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Polio. Our last work session for this evening is a new way forward, next steps to prepare for the 2021-22 school year. Dr. Polio.
Yes, thank you, Chair Porter. And this will be our first presentation to you on return to school. We will definitely have one for you. I believe that board meeting is the 27th of July. So we will at least have those two to give you information about returning. As you know, a great deal has changed in the past couple of weeks, which seems to have been, par for the course over the past 15 months. But what we did want to do is update you on what the state and KDE have given us, and then really focus in on, for us, what needs to be the focus of the new year is appropriate ventilation in schools. And then we'll also take some feedback from you about what you want to hear as we move forward on our return to school. I will say we've had a very successful first 2 days of our backpack league. I was at King Elementary yesterday and saw nearly 200 kids in great learning experiences, which I was really excited to see. It's been quite the task because, we are using nearly 100 community centers and partners and transporting our kids there, getting meals there. They start and finish at different times. And then we have about 25 of our school buildings that are filled with schools. But it's also, inspirational to see the kids back in there and excited, to be mostly excited. Some said that my mom made me come, but, it's good to see them learning. So we just did want to cover a couple things first. As you know, we were a little surprised at the release of the change in guidance on a Friday afternoon, but we did get word from KDE that they were rescinding the Healthy at Schools document that we have been using as our guidance for the better part of 15 months. And so that no longer exists, and it does become local decisions at this time. And then just updating you once again on the executive order that the governor and the Kentucky Department of Education on June 11th rescinded the guidance document, the guidance and safety expectations and best practices for Kentucky schools, commonly known as Healthy at Schools, with face coverings and social distancing measures no longer mandated. So as we move into the new school year, we will be addressing how this board would like to implement our return to school guidelines. We are a major part of the vaccination support for the state. So as you can see, we opened up 3 vaccination pop-ups clinics with Wild Health for anyone in the community. It doesn't just have to be JCPS students. Anyone 12 or older. We have them at Brandeis and Iroquois and Valley right now. So 3 communities that we are really working to make sure that we provide those vaccinations to our students who are eligible at this time, and anyone else that is 12 or above, even adults, we encourage to get vaccinated. We're working to create at least 6 more pop-up clinics in the coming weeks so that we can get as many of and we really are encouraging our parents for any of our students 12 and older to vaccinate students, obviously, prior to coming back to school. And then we are keeping a close eye on vaccination of children under 12. And we will be a close part of that work together with our Metro Health Department. Once that the CDC gives guidance that those are approved, we will then be working closely to provide those to parents who choose to do that. We still have PPE available at all of our sites, including summer schools, masks, hand sanitizer, and all the other items that we've worked on throughout the course of the year. So those still are available for students and staff. The main part of the presentation that we wanted to focus on was ventilation. That we see the work that our department, operations department, is doing great work when it comes to supporting ventilation, really going into classrooms and taking a look at those rooms in each and every school that might be concerned and addressing those with mitigation strategies. So I'm going to turn it over to Chief Operations Officer Chris Perkins to start this presentation.
Thanks, Dr. Polio, and good evening. Thanks for having us. And just to reiterate what he was speaking to just a minute ago, in addition to the PPE that we still have available for any students or staff that are in need of that or desire to have that, we've also gone to great lengths and expended quite a bit of resources and time and personnel as well to ensure that our buildings are healthy and safe as we brought students back to school through the summer programming and then leading into the fall. With me tonight, I've got Mr. James Jones. James is our specialist for mechanical maintenance. James is a mechanical engineer by trade. He has a background in heat transfer and thermodynamics, fluid dynamics, heat exchange, air conditioning, ventilation, air quality, refrigerants, and I could probably go on for a little bit, but I'll let James kind of talk you through what we've done this spring leading up to this point to get our buildings ready.
Thank you, Chris. We actually started back a small group of my team back last July of last year. So in July 2020, we started pulling ASHRAE standards, and everybody loves that name, the American Society of Heating, Refrigeration, and Air Conditioning Engineers. So we call it ASHRAE, so you can't pronounce it. So a lot of our policies, the things that Chris has been presenting, we were already doing when we reviewed our procedures last summer, because we were anticipating coming back in August. Then it became January, so we sort of modified along the way. So basically things we have done that we were always doing, that our plant operators change filters in the building 3 times each year to ensure free flow and air. What that basically means is if you get a clogged filter, we get low airflow, then you don't have proper ventilation in the room. As part of the starting up, the custodial staffs went in and had to remove every cover of every unit in every classroom in every school or every building and clean the units, wipe them down, and sanitize them. So they actually do this 3 times a year, but we actually went through a startup and also included my guys in it because there was units we wanted to see if they needed to be repaired, that outside air intakes was working. So I think I expended probably through 34 guys, 3 months of working 6-7 days a week actually to get through every building in the district. Some of these schools have a tremendous amount of wall-mounted units in it. So as part of also of this is our safety team. They do our Ieq testing. That's internal air quality that they talk a lot about. They do that actually periodically in the school buildings. They measure things like CO2. We have a small amount of CO2 sensors. We actually have one building that does demand CO2. That's Gings Academy. It actually uses CO2 to run the HVAC systems. But our boiler rooms all have CO2 sensors in them, so we worry about carbon monoxide there. So, yeah, the next one. So we also always did this. We inspect chillers and boilers at least yearly. We actually do it prior to startup when we do changeovers in the buildings, and there's a detailed checklist we use. We have about 28 water towers in the district that get tested monthly, and we're actually testing for buildup of corrosions and other bacteria and stuff for our cooling our chillers. We have a digital management system. This building is probably, I don't have to say probably, it's got the oldest digital management. It was put in 1991 on this building, but there is digital management. Even though we leave it for total control for the occupants of the building 7 days a week, we really don't shut things on and off in here. We never have. So This actually helps us a lot, especially around boilers. We can actually tell faults when they happen, and we actually get warnings on that. And I had a meeting on Friday with someone over chillers that I was challenging him to give me an app that when I can know when chillers actually go down, since we have all this digital monitoring, but we need more information. So as we do also inspection, this building has a huge air intake on it. So we had to go around and look at air intakes. A lot of them had leaves and stuff. The plant operators and my guys, we cleaned them because that's how we pull outside air. There's a huge one on this building or a huge one on the Lamb building. If you ever see a big grill when you go around back, that's actually an outside air intake. You know, we adjusted this. I actually did this last September. We adjusted everything to run longer because there's a principle in HVAC called dilution that we sort of gotten away from over the years. It was an energy efficient thing, is that we dilute the environment with air, outside air. And what that basically means, I want to change the air over in this room. You'll hear air change over, but we'll hear me talk more about dilution is if we go stand outside, that outside air. So the more I pull in this room, the more I take the contaminants out this room. So we're running the units starting at Sunday afternoon, Sunday evenings. I start them back up around 5 in the afternoon, and they go all the way to Saturday morning. We actually don't shut them off. So that's a principle of dilution. We are constantly revolving round and round. So I just hit that one. But then you hear me say things like they'll tell you about air exchanges, and what does an air exchange really mean? 6 air exchanges. There's diffusers above my head. There are probably 250 CFMs coming out of that. So I actually take the volume of this room. We then figure out how much air we have in this room and how much CFMs coming into the room. We just take the volume divided by the CFMs. That gives us air exchanges. This room is probably 6. I'm not going to say probably because I know I looked at this room specifically before you were coming back to the school. So air exchanges are important, but you also got to also make sure you've got enough outside air coming in. So ASHRAE has all of these standards. This room is 5 CFMs per person in this room. So if we have 100 people in this room, we need 500 CFM outside air coming in. If you go to a classroom, it's historically about 30. Most of our unit vents on the wall are going to be somewhere around 350 because we're anticipating 10 CFMs of air in a classroom with 30 kids. So the most of them are about 350 CFMs that they're running on the wall. And that guidance, as I've already touched on, they also clarified health officials, but we sort of knew this already about if your air handlers didn't bring in outside air, you can let up an exterior window. So basically, raising an exterior window is the same as pulling air. We have a unit running on the wall, is pulling air in a recirculation, it pulls air through the windows. So it actually pulls air into the building. So raising windows is a good way if you want to dump more air. But there's a word of caution I should say about when we start talking outside air. On hot, humid days, the more outside air I put in the system, the harder it is to control the temperature in the room. So it's a fine line of putting too much outside air in that we may not be able to cool or heat the building if we bring too much in. And said in rooms with no air, no, you can go to the next, Chris, it's all the same. In rooms that we didn't have outside air, that started to present a problem to us is that we had to come up with mitigation devices to try to handle if we did get a pollutants built up in the room. So along the way is, I think I've had over 400 mitigation devices, as we're calling them, put in. You know, we had into the schools with no outside air. We put 260 more in schools that have outside air. So let's take a building like Central High School. I believe you have it. Central has a lot of small offices that people have created that are no longer on the air handler system. So that required us to say, are you going to have multiple people in this office or this is an office by yourself? So that required us to come up with some type of mitigation device. And there was multiple ways we could do it, but certain devices, as I'll get into, work better in certain scenarios. You know, so then we had the sick room, isolation rooms. And a sick room that's a special device, and we call those mobile scrubbers. And they're actually got UVs in it, they've got helpers in it, and they have a pre-filter in it. And you'll basically find that meaning that it's straight for a medical room, is a specific device. It turns over a bunch of CFMs, and they fit in about a room. About a 10 by 10 room is about max that I would put one in. So when I talk about a mobile air scrubber next, it's basically a HEPA filter. It goes through a UV light first, then it goes to a pre-filter, HEPA filter, UV light. So basically you're scrubbing because if you're in an isolation room, you're assuming somebody is sick, putting contaminants in the air. So you're no longer assuming that you can turn the air over to get rid of it. So a lot of people have been talking about what is needlepoint ionization. What that basically means is what we're doing with that is, this is in the rooms that we only have a fan coil that has no outside units, is a way to try to clean particles out the air. But we also, I would still recommend we should raise a window in the room and try to get outside air into the room on days we can do it when it's not cold or humid. The UVGI, that's an ultraviolet germicidal radiation. That's a UVC light. There's 2 over my head. The purpose of those is not that I don't have enough outside air in this room. I just don't know how many people you're going to put in this room. So that is actually extra, because this building, for those people who work in it, this building actually has a tremendous volume of air, because I'm assuming, I've only been in the district 3 years, it was meant for a lot more people, because we overcooled this building. You will freeze on the 2nd and 3rd floor in here. Anyone working here knows I'm saying that. I get the calls all the time, but it's simply the fact the air handlers are so huge, and we put such a volume of air in it, that must have been a bigger heat load they was anticipating 20 years ago. It must have been a lot more people in this building for all of those who have been around here. So that UVGI is just for a large space when we think there'll be a larger crowd, even though I got enough air in here to take it. The next device is called, we're calling a Remy Halo, is another UVC. You can go to the Lamb building. That's when we run into cases like what we call DX units. It's like the ones in your houses. You go in your basement, in your closet, you see this pretty air handler. There's no outside air on any of those. So we use those, but I also use one in the Lamb building on one air handler, because there's a volume issue on one of the floors of how much air we're pumping into the space. We didn't have enough flow there when we calculated it. So there are some in the Lamb building. But mainly, if you go to a person's office, principals have most of the DXs that I've come across. The principal offices own their standalones. So that's where we put most of the Remy Halos that we had. And then we work a lot with facility planning, because there's an HVAC group that does all your new installs. So we're actually the person that are maintaining the day-to-day. When something breaks, we replace it, we upgrade it, but they also do new buildings. So they work hand in hand with us with their new buildings installed. And we end up having it, so we give them a lot of ideas of when they're doing renovations. A lot of times they're asking us what needs to be replaced, and we're also feeding them that.
And then I would piggyback onto that, what James was saying, just with kind of explaining, just in the last 18 years, ventilation, air conditioning especially, has become a priority for our district, as you see just some of the information in front of you. Capital improvement projects have included replacing the HVAC system in 87 schools, and then a lot of the mechanical systems that support the ventilation system. That's boilers, chillers, water coolers, digital controls, air handling units in 33 schools. That's just, or I'm sorry, 49 schools, and that's since 2003. This summer, we currently have 2 major HVAC renovation projects going on, and then there's several up for approval as well. Over $100 million, $52 million from capital funding, and another $47 million from ESSER funding that we're requesting to renovate the HVAC system in 7 schools, in addition to a lot of the mechanical systems in over 33 schools for another $13 million. So this has been a priority for us. It continues to be a priority. As James just mentioned, we are continuing to do research. We met with another vendor that has a new device last week, just to start looking at some alternatives in case something new comes out, and trying to vet that with proven research to make sure that we're keeping our families, our kids, our staff safe. And so we'll turn it back over to you, Dr. Polio.
Yeah, thank you, James and Chris. We appreciate it. And sorry, Dina, clearly James is the smartest guy in the room now, as I picked up about a quarter of what you said, James, but it sounded really good. We should have definitely brought you forward for many more of these sessions back about 3 or 4 months ago. That was a great job. We know you, a lot of confidence in the work that you all are doing, so please thank your team for us and all of those that are out there doing this work in the schools. Thank you very much.
I will call on board members if you have questions or comments, starting with Dr. Schul and then Board Member McIntosh, please.
No questions. Thank you for your work. We're trusting you. All right.
Well, I will say this is my wife works at Cochran Elementary, so she trusts me a lot. So I sent her back to school and told her she was okay.
The with an E or without an E?
The one with the E in J-Town.
Got you.
Well, don't forget the one without the E. Okay, downtown, please.
I was downtown here a couple of weeks ago looking at something.
Just want to be sure.
Thank you. Thank you for doing all of the hard math so that we don't have to. I only have one question about the approvals. You say that, I mean, I've looked at the consent agenda and I'm looking at what we have here. Do we have an estimate on a timeline for when those renovations would be completed, or are we still, with the rest of the world, backlogged on certain things because parts aren't available and everything because of the pandemic?
Yes. The answer to your question is yes. Right now, those that are up for approval would be summer projects for next summer, and that's in anticipation of materials and supplies being available. But we're also putting these on the board agenda a month earlier than we typically would to give us an extra month for planning and securing of resources.
Board Member Marshall and then Board Member Ms. Duncan.
All right, thank you, Chair Porter, and thank you all for this awesome work. I guess really my only question is, we talk about, our air systems in all of our schools. From your professional opinion, I know I see that we're putting a lot of money out into renovating a lot of our HVAC systems. So in your professional opinion, what's the best strategy for us going forward, when many of our facilities are failing and coming up to their end of life? We have a lot to consider versus replacing systems, renovation. So can you talk a little bit about, what strategy you see would be best for our current air systems?
I think our current air systems, like you say, across the board, a lot of them, we buy you time in maintenance because we actually replace them instead of renovating them. So a lot of the systems we do replace from my side of the building. I think when you're looking at full renovations, because that's a difficult, long process, I think strategically I would go after the schools with no outside air. Because dilution, like I say, when I'm not bringing outside air, I get into a comfort issue. And for as kids being able to learn in the classroom, if I'm opening windows still, I would be focused on those, would be going to the top of my priority list if it was me.
Okay. And so continue to let your voice be heard, because I know, like Dr. Polio said, I caught most of that, but more than anything, you know what you're talking about. So I appreciate all the work that you've done in, keeping our kids and our buildings comfortable and safe. So thank you.
Ms. Duncan.
So our questions primarily about the return to school based on the physical facilities, is that what we're questioning right now?
Yeah, we wanted to focus on ventilation. I think as the research has come out in recent months, we know that ventilation is critical and that we will be back to school in person. So that's why we wanted to report to you on the status of ventilation, and obviously hear from the smartest guy in the district. So,
well, is this work being done at schools while our programs are going on? Is it any problem with being able to do this upgrade or these updates on systems with our schools being occupied? So many of them are this summer.
From our end of the business, we work around the schools. So anywhere we're still looking at putting devices in, we're just working around the summer programs. Your bigger renovations are the schools are down and they've been coordinated. I believe we've got one starting in Newburgh and Farnsley. They've already know when they're going to be down, even though facility is handling that. We initiated it from maintenance for a replacement of a couple of units. So they're coordinating with them and they actually know when they're down. But for the stuff like what we do, if I have to take the school down, we normally just notify the principal or somebody there. We need to have the school down for a couple of days, no air.
Well, I learned a lot from what you said. Actually, I tried to keep up with it. I had watched a video earlier about this when another district had been working on this issue earlier, and it was so good to hear you talk about some of the same things that were in that video, and to see that we're doing the right things and we're really ahead of it. So I appreciate so much your expertise. Thank you.
Dr. Chris.
Thank you, Chair Porter. Dean, I guess it's good to know he used to consider you the smartest person in the district. I know, yeah. I'm sure you were not including board members in that, by the way. Right, yeah, exactly. And just for, I know you know this very well, for my colleagues, as we do think about just facilities in general going forward, there's a lot of research about student performance, absenteeism, and teacher retention are all significantly impacted by the quality of air in a building. So beyond COVID safety, there's a lot of benefits of focusing on this. For the ventilation specific questions, for the filters that we use, and with many things as a board member, I'm dabbling in areas that are not necessarily my expertise, so feel free to tell me if I'm just way off base with anything. But the filter ratings, I've been reading about MERV rating. Where do we stand on that?
On MERV ratings is, we run on air handlers, like on this building, MERV 8s. MERV 13 is what they call HEPA, but if we tried to put a MERV 13 in an air handler, it never fit. We're basically, a MERV 8 is about maybe max a 2-inch filters. These MERV 13s would be 4 to 6 inch.
Okay.
But the problem of getting it in is not the problem. It's the reduced airflow. So think of it like if I blow air through those bricks over there that's got a big opening, I get all the air in the world. I put a MERV 13, put a crack in the bricks right there in the mortars. So I'm trying to blow air through it. So it requires me to have much bigger air handler capacities to be able to handle that. We weren't designed that way. Now, if you're designing a future building, you can incorporate that into your design. So but it's impossible with the ones we've got at the moment.
Makes sense. So I think you said we have 400 mitigation devices like HEPA filters, or is that?
Yeah, we've got multiple forms. It could be, that's one. I put in probably 60, 80, or 100 of those halos in offices that are DX units. We put in the needle point ionizations on the schools. We were opening windows in to close some of the windows to try to make it more comfortable. I'm actually now out at Stone Street looking at something a little bit different, because I brought up dilution, because really it's two separate things. Ventilation is one thing, filtration is the other part of it. I'm looking at now dumping air in using an outside air unit, smaller one, into a room over there just to see how the technology worked, that a guy said. Instead of going straight to a needle point, I'm looking at, it's on an outside wall, I can pull air, let's see what it does, and we're doing that starting next week.
Cool. Excellent. Do you, in your professional opinion, do we need more like filtration units in classrooms to clean the air? Or, I mean, they're fairly inexpensive from what I understand, and we've got some money for once to spend on this.
How I take the in-classroom units, I guess one of those times when I tried to be a little smaller or talking to a couple of people in a room, the most difficult part I see about it is just the placement in the room of the unit. So if I bring a unit into a 30 by 15 classroom and I got this 500 square foot room, where do I sit this device? Because I have another device I'm running on the wall that is pulling air towards it at a much higher rate. So when we discuss them, you could use them, but no one could ever give me a good way. How would I determine the placement in the room? Or where would I put standalones? Do I buy 6 so I know I'm covered? Do I buy 1 or 2? Because there's an airflow issue, because I want to bring that air through it, through that still filter.
Okay, so you're saying we would see fairly minimal air cleaning with them?
I think the people close to the air cleaning would be okay. If you put it up through the front near you guys, if I'm sitting back there, I don't know in a classroom how much I would be able to do with a portable.
Gotcha. So like everybody would need one on their desk, basically. Yeah, we can't do that, obviously.
Or it would have to be analyzed and sized. How many do you put in a room by somebody based on airflow within the room?
Okay. All right. I feel fairly confident that the answer to this is no, based on your knowledge base, but we're not using like any ozone producing things, are we?
No, I looked into that from the get-go. When we were going into them, I actually looked into it, and I spent about 5 hours, if you wanted an interesting conversation with a guy one afternoon trying to convince me on using them. So I made sure he was EPA certified, that he was not producing those, any harmful particles, ozone, or anything.
Good, excellent. Earlier you were talking about the CFMs. I mean, I don't know if there is one kind of standard measure of this or if it's just kind of your professional opinion, but in all or most of all of our buildings, are the CFMs adequate for where we have?
Every
people?
building I've looked at is adequate, and every building that had a unit put on it was designed under ASHRAE 62.6.1, which says classrooms should be 10 CFM of fresh air per person.
Okay.
So everyone we've looked at, and then like I say, I have buildings like this that are way more capacity coming in than I would ever need for the amount of people that are in the space.
Okay, good. I'm trying to get all my questions into you before I go to a slightly different topic, but so let's see. Oh, you mentioned some CO2 meters. Is it worthwhile, in your opinion, and if it is it possible to have more of those? I know, for instance, and I'm not saying this is analogous to us, but in Belgium recently they mandated CO2 meters in every like restaurant, shopping area as a proxy for the buildup of aerosol transmission. Is that something that we should think about?
The CO2 meters really looks at all of us breathing in the
Right.
room when you use it that way. And it's looking for us to build up that we're not moving enough particles.
Right.
As long as we know our systems are functioning and the units are running in the room, we won't get CO2 buildup.
Yeah.
Like I say, Genes used it as a demand one. It was the only school that was done before I got here in the
Yeah.
district, where they monitored it in the room and then they would throw open the dampers wider and start blowing in more air is what it
Right.
basically does. So as long as we know we're sized properly and we're putting air in the room, we should never trip a CO2 meter unless we shut the units off and put all the people sitting in the room for hours on hours.
Right. And that makes sense that we should be okay. I'm just, as, especially as a parent, who's, thinking about my kids in these rooms, I think there could be something to having that kind of direct alert system, as it were, that, hey, something's not working like we thought it would in theory, or, there's something we didn't anticipate. Even the smartest guy in the district, you probably can't anticipate every single thing that, comes across in 100 and however many buildings we have. So I'm not, insisting necessarily that we spend a bunch of money on CO2, but it may be something that is worth looking into to, make sure that we don't get unexpected, I guess, buildup of particles. Let's see, I think that's all I have for you. I agree, by the way, Dr. Pulley, we should have had him much sooner. Thank you for the work that you do very much. I do have a few other questions related to just general kind of issues related to reopening and COVID. Do we know what percentage of our staff have been vaccinated? I know we offered it to all staff members. Do we know how many have been?
I think our number is about 12,000. Did we officially get 12,000?
We know 85% signed up.
That's 85% signed up, but we didn't keep who was that's where it's hard for us to
Okay.
know exactly the percentage, because that's kept by Louisville Metro Health.
Okay, so would they know that, or do they? I mean, they probably don't have a notation just for JCPS staff, do they? Or?
Yeah, I mean, they had some issues along the way of moving from one computer
Yeah,
system to
I remember
another, and so from them it would be difficult to do it unless we implemented some type of mandatory prove you're vaccinated type.
That kind of leads into my next question. I know students, we cannot mandate that they're vaccinated. What about staff? Can we mandate that staff are vaccinated?
I don't know that answer. I'd have to get some specifics. I don't know if I'll turn that over to the lawyer in the room, who's also pretty smart, by the way.
Yeah, he's all right. Yeah.
Technically can, but we would have to allow for religious and also medical exemptions.
Yeah.
It turns out not to be a mandate.
Okay. So what do you mean? So like religious, if somebody's just said it's against my religion?
Correct.
Okay.
Or other medical reasons.
Okay. I've read recently, and apologies if I'm kind of dealing with half information here, but I think the University of Kentucky recently said that you can upload like proof of vaccination, and then you don't have to wear a mask. You don't have to like do the symptom screening. Would that be something that we could do, or legally?
Just the other mitigation strategies, that's the reason.
Well, I mean, that those that we did not have confirmation were vaccinated had to meet a higher threshold, you know.
We can look into that, it's probably permissible.
Okay. And like I said, I may be remembering it wrong, but I think UK recently did something like that. So, yeah, if you could, that'd be great. You know, one of the things obviously that we have to keep an eye on is the variants of COVID that are out there. I know the so-called Delta variant or Indian variant in, I think, India, Singapore, and the UK, which the UK is at least as good at vaccinating as we've been, maybe even better, is kind of wreaking havoc. And a lot of cases there have been traced to schools in the UK. So obviously the Delta variant is not super prevalent here in Louisville. It's becoming more prevalent nationally, but it in all likelihood will be very prevalent in the U.S. by the fall. It affects kids much more severely. Even, you know, I think the Pfizer vaccination protection dips about 20 to 25% with the Delta variant. So even fully vaccinated people, especially the elderly that are fully vaccinated, are some of them are dying and having, you know, serious hospitalizations. You said it, I didn't. I'm worried about you. That's all. Yeah. So, you know, that makes me worry about the mask issue within schools, and I wonder, you know, so all the state did, they essentially, as you said, they rescinded all their guidance, right? So and I think you said it's a local decision at this time, you know, masks. So I mean, can you know, help me understand the decision, you know, to remove the mask mandate, you know, after that, you know, a day after that guidance was rescinded?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, you know, we had a real commitment to following the state guidance on this, and that's what we have done and continued to do that when that was taken away. You know, we have two choices in that. Obviously, this board can vote to mandate masks on students, but we've also been working with the Metro Health Department to, if it is not going to be a board decision, but a Metro mandate, that it be for all children in Metro Louisville and not just JCPS. So, you know, I can't say it was an easy one, but you know, by the day and time, it was becoming more and more difficult, especially when it came to summer learning, to have kids wearing this, and the response from families once the governor had his press conference. The response from families at our child care centers was, it was just going to be difficult to have that.
So is that, and this may be a Kevin question, but Kevin, did the board have the authority to impose a mask mandate within JCPS facilities now that there is no guidance from the state?
Yes, I think the board would have that authority.
So, you know, partially it's the question of, do we want one or not? Secondly, it's a question of, you know, it seems like what I'm hearing you say then is that's a board decision. So I'm a little bit frustrated that, you know, the board was not involved in that decision. And not only that, but I don't know about my colleagues, but I didn't know that decision was going to be made until it was made on a Saturday evening. So, you know, and I've received a lot of communication from parents and teachers that, you know, use words like shock, confusion, anger, frustration, disappointment to talk about their reaction to it. You know, one parent, you know, brought up the point that, you know, we had our kid in summer learning, we made those plans long time in advance, and now we have to take them out of summer learning because there's no mask mandate, who's, pretty irate about that. Understandably so, I think. Teachers likewise, I think everyone that I've talked to have been, surprised, and a lot of them, frankly, think the board did it, which is understandable. I mean, nobody really, should care how these decisions are made necessarily. Did we consult with local health officials before we made that decision? Did we consult with employee groups before making that decision?
Can I just stop for just a minute? This is a question that has come to all board members, and I am, in the interest of time, I would like for the board to receive the process and how we came to this decision. There are many questions that we will need to answer prior to the opening to school, and the questions that you're answering this evening that relates to the summer program, we thank you for that. But this is a bigger conversation than this one session. And even though you have focused on 2 items in this one session, I am giving the board a homework assignment, and that is to send your questions about opening school to Kevin Brown and Diane Porter, so we can start to shape what the work sessions are going to be looking like, because this is not a one-night event, and there are multiple questions that will need to be answered, and some of us have more questions than others. I want us to kind of wrap this up, and Dr. Chris, I know you have lots of questions, but in order to keep us focused and intentional on what we're attempting to do this evening, I would ask, every board member has questions about returning to school, about being in school right now, ventilation. This is a start to the conversation. This is not the end of the conversation. So having said that, all the legal questions that you have, I would ask that you send those to our general counsel also, so that we can develop what the sessions will be like as we move forward. There is going to have to be many conversations about what it will look like as we return to school. I don't think that I want us to be focused on that topic at that time as opposed to trying to mesh everything in. I mean, I've got a list of things I can go through tonight too. I'm not going to do that, but I am going to say a few things because in the interest of everybody's time, the focus was to be ventilation and that, but there are some other things that can be asked but not necessarily answered. So if all board members would agree to send their questions to the general counsel and to me if you want to, so we can formulate the information that this board will need as we go forward. Can we agree to that without having to take a vote, just by saying, okay, is that okay with you?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
And my only concern is the timing, given that the summer backpack league has started. Granted, the school year obviously doesn't start till after we meet a few more times, but the backpack league is going, and I have constituents that have had to radically alter their summer plans because of the mask requirement, or lack of mask requirement. So I guess that, in a way, that ship has kind of sailed at this point because that's been in session, and it's just unfortunate for those families. But so let me just kind of conclude then, and I'll follow that process and say that this removing masks is and there's all kinds of science that we can get into later about it, but I mean that's a huge decision that I'm concerned, Dr. Polio, that you made unilaterally, and I understand the reasoning that you stated, but I think there's other ways to look at it, and there are other perspectives that the board would have brought to that question. So that's ultimately a board decision, and a lot of people are, at least in my district, are blaming the board for that decision and pretty frustrated about it. And it's, not only do I not like to be blamed for something that wasn't my decision, but it's a decision that I disagree with. So, anyway, I'll just end it there. But I have a real problem with how that decision was made, and I hope that in the future we can avoid making decisions that way.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation this evening. Thank you for making us act like we know what you're talking about. But the good news is that we do have an authority in place that will make things better for JCPS. There was a statement that someone made about replacing HVAC systems in blank number of schools during blank number of time. And if that came from you, Mr. Perkins, would you please give me that information again so I can write it down? I have a follow-up after you give me the information. So if you would just give me what you said, I'd like to write it down.
Sure. Since 2003, we've replaced the HVAC systems in 87 schools.
87 schools?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, that's all I need to know.
Okay.
Thank you for your presentation tonight. I am concerned as we move forward with the ESSER funds and we are getting money from the federal government to look at infrastructure problems, that there is some equity within this district. I am a school board member representing Central High School very proudly. Since I came to this board, they have needed a HVAC system. Dr. Polio is tired of me talking about it, but once again, they are needing an HVAC system. I know now we are going to work on it. Those kinds of things must stop in JCPS. We haven't had money sometimes, but this time around we've got some money, and it's causing inequity in buildings, which ultimately will result in inequity in learning for our students. Everybody deserves a quality building, quality air, quality teachers, and all of those kinds of things. So I just want to make that statement this evening. It is not acceptable any longer. I am going to speak to it every time I can. I appreciate the presentation tonight. I would like a special meeting with you all to go over the schools in District 1 because I do have buildings with no windows. And that's not for tonight's conversation. We've had this conversation before, but before we go back to school, I don't want to take up the board time. I would like to meet with you, you, smart folks. I want to understand exactly what is going on in District 1, and I think every board member wants to be sure that we are providing a safe environment. But the inequity with what we have done within this district over time must stop. It must stop now. We have some money that is coming to us. I noticed that we're doing some things about security, and we've got a list of schools that are going to get different levels, phase 1, 2, and 3, but then we've got alternates depending on the funding. So I want to understand that's not a question to be answered right now. We've got funding. So if we don't use the funding to the best of our district, then I have a concern about that. But my final thought is thank you. Nice to know you. Please come visit Cochran in the city also. I know you're visiting a lot of schools, but I think it's very helpful for us to know that you are working in that capacity and that we are getting there. But I am in a district where I have multiple schools that have no windows. So I would like to have a conversation with you. But thank you both for your presentation this evening. Thank you. Dr. Polio, do you want to bring any closure to this, please?
No, thank you guys, appreciate it.
Okay, that takes care of all of our work sessions for this evening. We will now move on to the consent calendar. There's one item to be pulled down on the consent calendar, and it's item VL3, the Memorandum of Agreements with the Department of Education for the release of JCPS employees. So at this time, is there a motion to accept the consent calendar minus that one item, which I just read to you, which is the VL3 Memorandum of Agreements with the Kentucky Department of Education for the release of JCPS employees? Is there a motion, please? Ms. Duncan, seconded by Board Member McIntosh. Okay. All those in favor of the approving the consent calendar minus the item I mentioned, would you please raise your hand? Okay, the motion passes. It's unanimous. Now we will vote on the one item, which is the Memorandum of Agreements with the Kentucky Department of Education for the release of JCPS employees. All those in favor of that consent calendar item, would you please raise your hand? Oh, do I have to, I'm sorry, I have to have a motion, right? Okay, let's go back to the beginning. Is there a motion for that one item, the VL Memorandum of Agreements with the Kentucky Department of Education? Motion by Board Member Marshall, seconded by Dr. Chris. All those in favor of that item, please raise your hand. Okay. All those opposed and all those abstaining. Okay, we are all in favor except Board Member McIntosh, and she is abstaining to that particular item because of the work that she does away from this board meeting. So thank you, Board Member McIntosh, for making us aware of that. So I think that we have gone through everything that is on our agenda for this evening, I believe, but let me double check. Finished. So we will move on at this time for a motion to adjourn. I do want to say before we adjourn again that the board will start receiving speakers. We will make that information public for speakers, and so that we will go back to the receiving feedback from our community. So we'll be doing that very soon. It will be announced in the media. It will be announced on our website. Thank you to everyone that was here this evening, and it looks like it's about 8:50 p.m. Is there a motion to adjourn this evening? Board Member McIntosh, seconded by Board Member Marshall. All those in favor? It's unanimous. Thank you very much. And before I say good night, I should have started with Happy Father's Day last weekend to everybody, and thank you, everybody, for the work that you do. Have a great evening. Thank you.